AITA for refusing to share my lottery winnings with my boyfriend after he joked about how he'd spend it. A couple of weeks ago, something absolutely crazy happened. A 25-year-old woman won $50,000 from a scratch-off lottery ticket. $50,000. It still doesn't feel real when I think about it. For context, I've always been the type of person who doesn't win much more than a free coffee or a donut from those little peel and win promotions. I've played the lottery here and there for fun, but it was never something I seriously expected to hit big on. This time, though, my numbers aligned, and suddenly, my life felt like it was flipping upside down. When I realized I'd won, I was over the moon. I screamed, I jumped up and down in my tiny apartment, and I even started crying happy tears. It's not life-changing millionaire money, but for someone like me, it felt huge. I've been living paycheck to paycheck for years, struggling to pay off my student loans and just keep my head above water. This money meant I could finally get ahead, maybe even start saving for a real future. I was buzzing with excitement and couldn't wait to tell my boyfriend, Jake. Jake, 27, male, and I have been dating for about 2 years now. We met through mutual friends, and honestly, things have been great, well, mostly great. He's funny, charming, and incredibly supportive in a lot of ways. He's always been there for me when I've had rough days at work or when I've felt overwhelmed by life. That said, we don't live together yet, and while we've talked about moving in together eventually, it hasn't felt like the right time. We're both still working on getting our lives in order, me with my loans and Jake with his credit card debt. But we've been solid as a couple, and I could see us having a future together. Anyway, after I cashed in the ticket and the money officially hit my bank account, I felt this overwhelming sense of excitement and disbelief. My hands were shaking as I stared at the balance on my phone screen, refreshing it over and over again to make sure it wasn't some sort of mistake. Once it really sank in that the money was real, I couldn't wait to tell Jake. He was the first person I wanted to share the news with, not because I felt obligated, but because I thought he'd be thrilled for me, maybe even proud. My heart was racing as I called him, and when he answered, I could barely get the words out because I was grinning so hard. When I finally managed to tell him, his initial reaction was everything I hoped it would be. He let out this loud, excited whoop, and I could practically hear the smile in his voice through the phone. "No way. Are you serious? That's amazing, babe," he said, and I felt this incredible rush of happiness, knowing I'd made him proud. We laughed together as I told him how surreal it felt and how I'd never expected something like this to happen to me. It felt so good to share that moment with him, and for a little while, everything was perfect. But then, things started to shift. Jake's excitement turned into playful jokes, which at first seemed harmless. "Looks like it's time for that gaming setup I've been dreaming of," he teased, making me laugh. "Or maybe it's finally time to upgrade that old clunker of yours," he added, and honestly, I didn't disagree. My car had been on its last legs for months, and the thought of replacing it had been hovering in the back of my mind even before I won the money. At first, it felt like a normal, light-hearted conversation between us, dreaming about what we could do with a little extra cash, the way people always do when the idea of money comes up. But as the night went on, his jokes started to take on a different tone. They stopped feeling playful and began to sound a bit more serious, as if he wasn't just imagining what we could do with the money, but actively planning for it. "I guess I don't have to save for that trip to Europe anymore, your treat, of course," he said, laughing, but the way he lingered on the word "your" made something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. Then came, "Oh, babe, this means you can help me pay off my credit card debt, right? That would really take a load off my shoulders." This one wasn't even framed as a joke, it felt more like a statement, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I forced myself to laugh along, not wanting to ruin the mood, but inside, I could feel this creeping unease starting to take hold. This was my money. I had bought the ticket with my own hard-earned cash, scratched it off with my own hands, and now it felt like Jake was staking some kind of claim to it. He wasn't asking me what I wanted to do with the money, or even congratulating me anymore. He was just assuming that it was suddenly a shared windfall. As he kept talking, I realized his comments weren't just hypothetical musings. They were starting to feel like expectations. By the time he started suggesting even bigger plans, like using the money to put a down payment on a house together or buy an investment property, I could barely keep up with my own thoughts. He made it sound like this money wasn't just mine, it was ours. There was no, "What do you think?" or "Would this be something you'd want to do?" It was as if the decision had already been made. It was jarring, to say the least. I had expected Jake to be happy for me and maybe even a little curious about what I planned to do, but instead, it felt like he'd already decided what we would do with the money, whether I liked it or not. I tried to redirect the conversation, hoping to bring it back to something more grounded and practical. I told Jake about my plans for the money, speaking carefully but excitedly. I explained how I wanted to save most of it, maybe look into investing a portion to grow it over time, and definitely use a chunk to pay down my student loans. It wasn't flashy or glamorous, but it felt like the most responsible and meaningful way to use this unexpected windfall. I even mentioned that I'd set aside a little for something fun, a trip, maybe, or a special treat for myself, since I'd never had the chance to splurge on anything before. But the majority of it? I wanted to keep it safe, to use it as a stepping stone toward financial stability and independence. As I spoke, I thought Jake would nod along, maybe smile and say he was proud of me for thinking ahead. Instead, his face fell. "Wow," he said after a pause, shaking his head slightly, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "So, you're just gonna hoard it all for yourself? That's kind of selfish, don't you think?" His words hit me like a slap in the face. Selfish? I blinked, genuinely taken aback. This was my money, the result of my luck, my ticket, my $10 spent at the corner store on a whim. How could he call me selfish for wanting to use it in a way that would help secure my future? For a moment, I was too stunned to respond, my mind scrambling to make sense of what he'd just said. Finally, I took a deep breath and tried to explain. "I'm not trying to be selfish, Jake," I said, keeping my voice calm even though I felt my chest tightening with frustration. "I'm just trying to be smart about this. This kind of money doesn't come around often, and I want to make sure I use it wisely. You know how hard I've been working just to stay afloat. This is my chance to get ahead, to pay off my loans, and maybe even start saving for something bigger. It's not like I'm blowing it all on myself." But he didn't seem to hear me, or if he did, he wasn't willing to understand. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, and gave me this look, half disbelief, half disappointment. "Couples share everything," he said, his tone almost scolding. "I've been there for you through so much, and now, when you finally have something big, you don't want to share it with me? What does that say about our relationship?" His words stung, but they also made me defensive. I pointed out that while he has been supportive emotionally, I've always been financially independent. I've never asked him for help with my bills or debts, and I've never expected him to share his money with me. So why was it suddenly different now that I had some extra cash? He didn't seem to have a good answer, and the conversation spiraled from there. Jake accused me of not being serious about our relationship, saying that if I really loved him and saw a future with him, I wouldn't hesitate to use the money for our benefit. He even brought up some of his past sacrifices, like how he's taken me out to dinner or helped me move apartments. For the record, I've also done plenty for him, but I guess that didn't count in this situation. The argument ended with him calling me greedy and saying he needed some time to think. Since then, things have been tense between us. He's been distant, and when we do talk, he brings up the money in little passive-aggressive comments like, "Must be nice to have so much you don't know what to do with it," or, "Guess I'll just keep struggling while you're sitting on your pile of cash." I don't know what to do. On one hand, I feel like I have every right to keep this money for myself and use it how I see fit. On the other hand, his reaction is making me question everything. Am I being selfish? Should I be more open to sharing with him? Does this really mean I'm not serious about our relationship? The whole situation has left me feeling confused and, honestly, a little hurt. I thought Jake would be happy for me, but instead, it feels like he sees me as a walking wallet now. I keep replaying our argument in my head, wondering if I said or did something wrong. So, Reddit, AITA for not wanting to share my lottery winnings with my boyfriend? Update 1. A few days passed after the initial argument, and I thought maybe the dust was finally settling. Jake had been quieter than usual, but part of me hoped it was because he'd had time to reflect on how unreasonable he'd been. I even started to convince myself that he'd come around, that he'd see things from my perspective and maybe apologize for how he'd acted. I didn't bring it up again because, frankly, I needed a break from the stress of it all. I wanted to enjoy this rare stroke of good fortune, not spend my time defending myself over something that shouldn't even be an issue. But then, out of nowhere, Jake called me. It wasn't a normal, casual check-in kind of call, either. The tone in his voice was clipped, almost formal, and right away I could tell this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. He started by asking me, once again, what I planned to do with the money. His tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent of impatience, like he was trying to sound calm but couldn't fully mask his frustration. I reiterated what I'd already told him, that I planned to save most of it, pay off my student loans, and set some aside for the future. I mentioned, again, that I might use a little for something fun, a trip or maybe upgrading my car, but I was focused on being responsible. I was trying to keep things light, but he cut me off before I could finish. This time, Jake didn't bother with the jokes or the passive-aggressive comments. He cut right to the chase, his voice firm and almost rehearsed. He told me, with complete confidence, that he believed he was entitled to half of the winnings. He didn't phrase it as a suggestion or a request, it was a statement of fact, as if this was something we'd both already agreed upon, which, of course, we hadn't. Jake explained, in what I assume he thought was a logical tone, that because we were in a committed relationship, the money wasn't just mine, it was ours. He made it sound like this was the natural, unquestionable course of action, as though there was no scenario where I wouldn't share it equally with him. He kept going, laying out his reasoning as if he were presenting a legal case. Relationships, he said, were built on trust and mutual support. According to him, the money should be treated the same way, something shared, something that belonged to both of us equally because we'd been together through everything. He said it wasn't just about the money itself but about what it represented, a partnership, a shared life, and, in his words, a future we're building together. Jake was careful to frame it as if it was about love and commitment, but the more he spoke, the more his entitlement started to seep through. His words weren't a discussion, they were a declaration, a claim on something that wasn't his. The more he talked, the harder it became for me to process what he was saying. I was completely stunned. My mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the person I thought I knew with the person on the phone who was calmly insisting he had a right to something he had absolutely no part in. Half. He wanted half of my lottery winnings. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me disoriented and shaken. This wasn't some small disagreement over how we'd celebrate or a misunderstanding about a minor expense, this was Jake outright claiming ownership of something that, by every possible measure, was mine alone. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to understand how he could justify this to himself. We weren't married. We didn't live together. We didn't share bank accounts or bills or even have any sort of financial entanglement. In fact, we deliberately kept our finances separate for the entirety of our relationship. This wasn't some long-term partnership where we built a life together and shared everything along the way. We were dating. Dating. And yet here he was, acting as though my winnings were some sort of communal property just because we were in a relationship. It wasn't just shocking, it was infuriating. I couldn't even wrap my head around the entitlement it took to demand something like this. How had he come to the conclusion that he had a right to anything I'd won, let alone half? It was like he'd completely erased the fact that I was the one who bought the ticket, scratched it off, and claimed the prize. Jake hadn't contributed a single dollar, a single second, or a single ounce of effort to that win. And yet here he was, acting as though his mere presence in my life gave him a legal and moral claim to my money. I could feel the anger building in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice before I responded. I reminded Jake, as evenly as I could, that I had purchased the ticket with my own money. I scratched it off myself, cashed it in myself, and deposited the winnings into my account, my personal account, not a shared one, because we didn't have one. I pointed out that this was my win, not ours. There was no we in this situation. It had been me, alone, standing at the counter when I decided to buy that ticket, and me, alone, who was fortunate enough to win. Jake hadn't contributed a single dollar to that ticket, and he had no right to claim any of the prize. I thought this would end the conversation, or at least make him realize how absurd he was being. But then Jake hit me with something I never in a million years expected. He said that if I didn't agree to give him half of the winnings, he would take me to court. To court. I could barely believe what I was hearing. For a moment, I thought he had to be joking, but the seriousness in his tone made it clear he wasn't. He actually thought he had a legal claim to my money, and he was willing to escalate things to that level if I didn't comply. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me as I listened to him go on about how a judge would side with him because we were in a committed relationship and he'd been there for me. The sheer entitlement was staggering. I couldn't believe that someone I thought I knew, someone I trusted, was now threatening legal action over money that he had no part in winning. I didn't hold back this time. I told him, point blank, that he had absolutely no right to demand anything from me, let alone half of my winnings. I reminded him that we weren't married, we didn't have any shared assets, and there was no legal or moral basis for his claim. I told him that if he tried to take me to court, he would be wasting his time, because no judge in their right mind would rule in his favor. This money was mine, fair and square, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Jake faltered at that point. I could tell he hadn't expected me to push back so hard, and it was clear that he didn't have a solid argument to counter me. He tried to come up with something, mumbling about how relationships are supposed to be partnerships and how I was betraying him by refusing to share, but his words lacked conviction. It was like he realized, in real time, that he had no leg to stand on. There was a long, awkward silence after that, as he tried to figure out what to say next. But nothing came. He'd run out of arguments, and the more he tried to justify himself, the more ridiculous he sounded. I stayed quiet, waiting for him to either backpedal or hang up, but he just sat there, floundering. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that this wasn't just about the money. This was about who Jake really was, about the entitlement, the selfishness, and the complete disregard for my autonomy. The man I thought I knew, the man I'd spent 2 years with, was willing to threaten me over something that was rightfully mine. And no matter how he tried to spin it, there was no coming back from that. Update 2. A few days later, after our heated conversation about his claim to half my lottery winnings, I got another call from Jake. By this point, I was already on edge whenever I saw his name pop up on my phone. The whole situation had left such a bad taste in my mouth that I wasn't exactly eager to talk to him again. But a part of me thought, maybe foolishly, that he was calling to apologize. Maybe he'd finally come to his senses, realized how ridiculous and entitled he'd been, and wanted to make things right. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Right away, I could tell something was different. His tone wasn't as sharp or confrontational as it had been the last time we spoke. Instead, it was softer, almost hesitant, like he was testing the waters. He started off with some small talk, asking about my day, how work was going, the usual pleasantries, but it all felt forced, like he was leading up to something. I could sense there was an ulterior motive, but I decided to let him get to it on his own. I didn't want to assume anything, even though I had a nagging feeling this wasn't just a casual check-in. After a bit of awkward chit-chat, Jake finally brought up the topic he'd clearly been dancing around. He said he'd been thinking a lot over the past few days, about our relationship and where it was heading. I felt a twinge of curiosity but also a heavy dose of suspicion. Then he dropped the bomb. He said he wanted to talk about the idea of marriage. Marriage. My first thought was pure confusion. What? Where was this coming from? In the 2 years we'd been dating, we'd never seriously discussed marriage. Sure, it had come up in passing, but it was always something vague and far off, not something either of us had actively planned or even hinted at doing anytime soon. And now, out of nowhere, Jake was suddenly talking about getting married. I couldn't help but ask him what he meant by that. Was he seriously proposing, or was this some kind of hypothetical conversation? His answer was as vague as it was surprising. He said he'd been reflecting on our relationship and how much he cared about me, and he thought maybe it was time to take the next step. On the surface, it sounded sweet, but something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. There was an edge to his voice, a layer of calculation that I couldn't ignore. It didn't feel genuine. It felt strategic. The longer he talked, the clearer it became that this wasn't a heartfelt, spontaneous moment of clarity about our love. This wasn't about commitment or building a life together. This was about the money. He didn't say it outright, but the subtext was impossible to miss. Jake wasn't suddenly in love with the idea of marriage, he was in love with the idea of securing a legal claim to my winnings. My confusion quickly turned to disbelief. Was this guy seriously suggesting marriage now, in the middle of all this drama about the lottery money? Did he really think I wouldn't see through it? And then it hit me, of course, he thought this was the perfect move. In his mind, this was the solution to the problem of my independence. If we got married, he probably figured he'd automatically have access to my winnings, or, at the very least, a much stronger claim to them. It was almost laughable. The sheer audacity, the boldness of it, was staggering. I could feel my disbelief bubbling over into laughter, and before I knew it, I actually let out a laugh, short, sharp, and completely involuntary. I couldn't help it. The whole thing was so absurd, so transparent, that I didn't even know how to respond. Jake didn't take the laugh well. He immediately got defensive, asking what was so funny. I didn't even try to hide my amusement as I told him that if he thought getting married would somehow give him access to my money, he was sorely mistaken. I told him point blank that it wouldn't work, and I wasn't stupid enough to fall for such a blatant ploy. He tried to interrupt me, to defend himself and insist that this wasn't about the money, but I wasn't buying it. Not for a second. The timing alone made his intentions painfully obvious. If he'd truly been thinking about marriage for the right reasons, he wouldn't have waited until there was a $50,000 jackpot on the table to bring it up. That's when he switched tactics. He started calling me selfish again, just like he had during our previous conversation. He said that in a real relationship, couples share everything. He went on about how my refusal to share the money, or even consider sharing it, showed that I wasn't serious about our future together. He painted himself as the victim, saying that all he wanted was for us to be partners, to support each other, and to build a life together. But the more he talked, the more it sounded like he was trying to guilt me into doing what he wanted. It was the same tired argument he'd used before, dressed up in slightly different language. I couldn't stop myself from laughing again, this time louder and more bitterly. The audacity was just too much. Here he was, once again, acting like this money was his by default, like my reluctance to hand over half of it was some kind of betrayal. I reminded him, as bluntly as I could, that we weren't married, we didn't live together, and we didn't have any shared financial responsibilities. There was absolutely no reason for him to expect, let alone demand, anything from me. His argument about sharing sounded hollow and ridiculous, especially coming from someone who had contributed absolutely nothing to this win. Jake kept trying to salvage the conversation, but it was clear he was running out of steam. His arguments were repetitive, and the more he talked, the more transparent his motives became. He tried to spin it as a conversation about our relationship, about love and commitment, but every word out of his mouth just reinforced what I already knew: this wasn't about love. It was about greed. It was about control. And it was about his inability to accept that this money wasn't his to claim. By the time the call ended, I was more certain than ever that I was seeing a side of Jake I didn't like, and couldn't ignore. This wasn't just a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was a fundamental difference in values, a glaring red flag that I couldn't unsee. And no amount of sweet-talking or manipulation was going to change that.